Imagine waking up one morning believing your life is stable, your marriage, your home, your future. And then, within a single breath, everything collapses. Your husband throws you out, strips away your security, and leaves you with nothing but a faded debit card that once belonged to your father. A man who's no longer here to explain why he kept it hidden. You walk into a bank hoping for a spark of luck, maybe a few dollars, maybe nothing at all. But instead the entire staff suddenly freezes. Their faces drain. A quiet panic spreads behind the counter. And in that moment, you realize, this card holds a secret no one prepared you for. What could possibly be inside that old account? And why does the bank seem more afraid than surprised? This is the story of how one woman lost everything and uncovers something far bigger than betrayal. It's strange how the worst days of our lives never announce themselves. They don't arrive with thunder or warnings or a gentle tap on the shoulder. They slide in quietly, disguised as an ordinary morning, just like the one she woke up to. She moved through her home the way she always did, the soft clatter of dishes, the faint hum of the kettle, the simple routines that make us feel safe. But beneath it all, something was already shifting. Her husband's voice, once warm and steady, carried a sharp edge. His eyes wouldn't meet hers. And before she could make sense of it, he delivered a sentence that would split her world in two. He told her to leave. No explanation that made sense, no moment to breathe or steady herself, just a sudden command that turned her from a wife into an outsider in her own home. She stood there stunned, feeling as though she'd been pushed out of her own life. The man she trusted, the partner she believed she understood, was no longer someone she recognized. He had already packed her things neatly, almost coldly, as if he'd rehearsed this moment long before telling her. That's the part that cut the deepest. This wasn't anger. This wasn't a fight. This was preparation. And when someone prepares for your absence before telling you, it means they have already removed you from their heart. As she carried her bags out the door, she felt the weight of 100 questions pressing against her chest. What had she done wrong? Why today? And how could a life built over years be dismantled in minutes? Outside, the world moved normally, cars passing, neighbors walking dogs, the same old sky hanging above her, yet everything felt foreign. She tried to reach for something familiar, something steady, but her life had narrowed down to a suitcase and a phone with no one she could realistically call. That's when her fingers brushed against it, the old debit card tucked inside her father's worn leather wallet. A card she never paid attention to, never questioned, because it belonged to a man who had always lived modestly. It seemed almost meaningless at first, just another forgotten item from a parent's belongings. But that small rectangle of plastic suddenly felt like an anchor, the only tangible link to a life where she once felt protected. And when someone loses everything, even a sliver of hope feels worth chasing. As she looked at the card more carefully, a quiet determination rose inside her. Maybe it held nothing. Maybe it held enough for a night in a cheap motel. Or maybe, just maybe, it held something her father never had the chance to tell her. That curiosity, that whisper of possibility, was enough to pull her forward. She wiped her tears, steadied her breath, and started walking toward the nearest bank. She didn't know it yet, but the moment she stepped inside, her life would take another sharp turn, one even more shocking than being thrown out of her home. Because the card wasn't just forgotten, it wasn't just old. It was dangerous. And the people inside that bank were about to prove it. The walk to the bank felt longer than it really was. When life collapses suddenly, even short distances stretch out like empty highways. She kept turning the card over in her hand, studying every scratch, every faded number, as if the plastic itself might whisper answers. Her father had passed years ago, leaving behind memories of a quiet, hard-working man. Someone who never flaunted wealth, never hinted at secrets, never behaved like someone who had anything extraordinary tucked away. That's what made the card so puzzling. Why would he keep an active account she had never heard about? And why wasn't it canceled after his death? The more she tried to connect the dots, the more the questions grew heavier than the luggage she carried. When she finally reached the bank's glass doors, a nervous tremor slipped through her fingers. She wasn't expecting miracles. She wasn't even expecting much kindness. She just needed enough to survive the night, maybe a few dollars, maybe nothing at all, but she had to try. Inside, the air felt colder, the fluorescent lights too bright, and everyone moved with a quiet efficiency she almost envied. She waited in line, clutching the card as though someone might snatch it from her. The closer she got to the counter, the more her heart pounded. What if the card was empty? What if it wasn't even valid anymore? But what if there was something? A deposit her father forgot to mention? A savings he never touched? Hope is a funny thing. It can be fragile, but it can also push you forward when everything else feels lost. When her turn came, she stepped up to the counter and placed the card gently on the desk. The teller, a young woman with calm eyes, smiled politely, as if this were just another routine interaction. She asked for identification, typed in a few numbers, and scanned the card without any hint of concern. For a brief moment, everything felt normal, predictable. But then the teller's brows pulled together. Her fingers froze above the keyboard. She looked at the screen again, this time more slowly. The polite smile faded. And before the woman could ask what was wrong, the teller excused herself, saying she needed to check something in the back. It was the way she said it, quiet, deliberate, that made the woman's stomach tighten. Something was off. Very off. Minutes passed. Too many minutes. The teller didn't return. Instead, two other employees appeared behind the counter, whispering to each other while glancing at her card from a distance. Their hushed tones grew heavier, their expressions turning from confusion to something she couldn't fully read. Concern? Fear? Urgency? And with every passing second, she felt the weight of the unknown press harder against her chest. Why were they reacting like this? What could possibly be on that account to make trained bank staff freeze? She had walked in expecting disappointment, maybe embarrassment, but not this. Whatever her father had left behind wasn't just money. It was a secret large enough to unsettle an entire bank. The silence inside the bank grew heavier by the second, wrapping around her like a thick fog. She watched the employees huddle near a side office, their voices low, their movements tense. This was no routine check, no minor glitch. Something about her father's card had triggered concern far bigger than she expected. People don't whisper like that over a small savings account. People don't stare at a customer with that mixture of caution and disbelief unless they've stumbled upon something unusual, something they don't quite know how to handle. And the more she stood there waiting, the more she felt her heart pounding against her ribs. What had her father left behind? And why did she feel like she wasn't supposed to be standing there at all? Finally, a senior employee appeared, a man in a dark suit with the practiced smile of someone trained to stay calm in unusual situations. But even he couldn't hide the slight stiffness in his posture. He introduced himself politely and invited her into a private office to discuss the account. That one word, discuss, hung in the air like a warning. Inside the small office, he closed the door and sat across from her, folding his hands on the table as if preparing for a delicate conversation. He asked again who she was, how she got the card, whether she was aware of any special instructions connected to it. Special instructions? Her confusion must have shown on her face because his own expression softened, though the tension behind his eyes didn't fade. He turned his screen slightly away from her, clearly trying to prevent her from seeing the details. But she caught enough. Long strings of numbers, unusually large transaction codes, a security flag blinking in red. She saw the hesitation in his fingers before he continued typing, as if each keystroke could trigger something bigger, and then he paused completely. This account, he said slowly, appears to be linked to a high-priority classification. She didn't know what that meant. She didn't know banks even had classifications like that. But one thing was clear, her father had access to something far beyond an ordinary savings account. The man in the suit asked for a moment and stepped outside, leaving her alone in a room suddenly too small, too bright, too full of questions. When he returned, he wasn't alone. A second administrator accompanied him, older, more serious, the kind of man who didn't waste words. He placed the card back on the table and said, with unsettling calm, "We need to verify your identity with our central office before proceeding." Central office? For one debit card? Her hands grew cold. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about inheritance. Her father hadn't simply saved something, he had hidden something. And the bank's reaction made it clear that whatever he left behind wasn't meant to be discovered easily. As she sat there, surrounded by strangers who seemed to know more about her father than she ever did, one thought echoed louder than the rest. What secret had he been protecting all these years? As she sat in that cold office, waiting for the bank to verify her identity, her thoughts drifted back to her father in a way they hadn't in years. He had always been a quiet man, steady and soft-spoken, someone who moved through life without drawing unnecessary attention. He worked long hours, came home tired but gentle, and rarely spoke about his past. She had always assumed that silence meant simplicity, that he had lived an unremarkable life, that there was nothing to uncover. But now, sitting in a bank that reacted to his old debit card like it contained state secrets, she realized how little she actually knew about him. Had he been hiding something to protect them? Or to protect himself? She remembered moments that suddenly felt different. The way he would pause when certain news came on TV, the way he avoided conversations about money, the way he always kept his documents locked away, even from family. At the time, she thought it was just the habit of an older, careful man. But was it? Her father had once told her, in one of their rare serious conversations, that not everything needs to be shared to be true. She hadn't understood what he meant back then. Now those words sounded less like wisdom, and more like a warning. What had he lived through that made secrecy feel safer than honesty? The bank's reaction echoed in her mind. The hushed whispers, the immediate escalation, the coded alerts. These weren't signs of a forgotten account or a dormant inheritance. These were signs of sensitivity, the kind reserved for people who once held influence, access, or power. But her father had never seemed powerful. He was humble, almost to a fault. So where did this hidden life fit into the man she knew? She tried to piece together fragments of memory, but the puzzle refused to form a picture. It was as if there were two versions of her father, the gentle parent she grew up with, and a shadowy figure she was only now beginning to meet. Just as these thoughts swirled in her mind, the office door opened, and the senior administrator stepped back inside. His expression was different now, more careful, more measured. He sat down slowly, as if choosing every movement with precision. "We've reached the central verification team," he said. "And before we proceed, there's something you need to know about your father." Her breath caught. The room felt suddenly smaller. This wasn't going to be about a hidden savings account. This wasn't even going to be about money. Whatever her father kept buried had been significant enough for a bank, and perhaps more than just a bank, to still treat it with extreme caution. She braced herself, sensing that the truth she sought was about to rewrite everything she believed about her father's past. The administrator's voice lowered as he spoke, as if the walls themselves needed to be kept out of the conversation. He explained that the account tied to her father wasn't listed in their regular system at all. It sat in a separate restricted database, the kind used for individuals under federal confidentiality agreements, high-security clients, or people connected to sensitive financial operations. None of those descriptions matched the father she remembered. The man who fixed broken chairs, who saved coins in jars, who always worried about the price of groceries. How could he be connected to an account like this? The administrator admitted he didn't have clearance to access the full history, but what little he could see already made the room feel colder. He revealed that the account had been flagged years ago, locked under a classification normally reserved for deceased clients with protected backgrounds. Protected. That word lingered in her mind like an unanswered riddle. Protected from what or whom? The strangest part was that the account wasn't empty. Not even close. It held a balance large enough to make even the administrator hesitate before referencing it. He never said the number out loud, but she saw the flicker in his expression, the kind of stunned disbelief that comes only when something far exceeds expectations. It was clear this wasn't a retirement fund or a forgotten savings deposit. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't have been accessible to anyone but her father. The administrator continued cautiously, explaining that accounts like this were usually tied to people who had either worked with large institutions, confidential programs, or specialized contracts, often the type that stayed hidden from public view. She shook her head, unable to imagine her father in such a world. Yet every new detail pushed her further from the version of him she thought she knew. Why would he hide something so significant from his own family? What had he been involved in? And why had he left the card behind, almost as if he knew she would need it one day? The more she tried to make sense of it, the more the pieces refused to align. Then came the part that made her skin prickle. The administrator admitted that the only reason the system even allowed a preliminary check was because her attempt at accessing the card triggered an automatic alert, a notification that the account, dormant for years, had suddenly been touched. This account, he said carefully, wasn't meant to be accessed anymore. Not by anyone without authorization. The implication was clear. Her father had left behind a financial ghost, an account that technically shouldn't exist, at least not in the ordinary world. And now, by simply walking into a bank and trying to check the balance, she had awakened something that had been quiet for far too long. Something that might attract attention far beyond the walls of this building. As the shock of the account's existence settled over her, another realization began to take shape, one that tightened her chest more than anything the bank had revealed. Her husband's sudden decision to throw her out hadn't been random. It hadn't been emotional. It hadn't even been personal in the way she once feared. No. It had been strategic, calculated. The timing now felt too precise to ignore. Her attempt to use the card happened the same day he kicked her out. Was that a coincidence? Or had he known something about her father's hidden account long before she did? The thought sent a cold wave through her spine. She replayed the last few weeks in her mind, and suddenly his distant behavior, the secretive phone calls, and the quiet tension in the house began to make a terrifying kind of sense. She remembered the night he came home late, smelling of expensive cologne that wasn't his, carrying a briefcase he had never owned before. She asked where he had been, and he gave a vague answer about meeting someone from work. But now, in hindsight, she saw what she had missed. The fear behind his eyes, the way he avoided her gaze, the way he seemed to watch her reactions more than listen to her words. Could he have been approached by someone? Someone who knew about her father? Someone who wanted the account? The possibility made her feel suddenly sick. If her father had kept something powerful and protected, then others might have known about it too, including people who had been watching her long before she realized she was being watched. The administrator's earlier words echoed in her mind. This account wasn't meant to be accessed anymore. If her husband had discovered its existence somehow, he might have feared that she would inherit it, or that the moment she tried to use the card, everything would point back to him. Throwing her out might have been his attempt to control the situation, to keep her away from something he wanted for himself, or perhaps to distance himself from the trouble he anticipated. But trouble for whom? For her, or for him? As she pieced together the fragments, a frightening truth emerged. Her husband hadn't abandoned her. He had been protecting himself from whatever storm he believed was coming. The more she thought about it, the clearer the betrayal felt, sharper, deeper, more deliberate than she could have imagined. Her marriage had been unraveling not because of emotional distance, but because of secrets he never intended her to uncover. He had underestimated her father's hidden legacy, underestimated the bank's reaction, underestimated her. And now, as she sat inside that small office, realizing the layers of deception surrounding her life, she understood that the bank wasn't the only place where alarms had been triggered. Her husband had made his move. The question now was whether she would make hers, and whether she was already far too deep in a game she never agreed to play. The moment she stepped out of the bank, the world felt different, heavier, sharper, as if the air itself knew a secret she wasn't ready to hear. The administrators had advised her to stay reachable, a phrase that echoed like a warning rather than a request. She walked down the street in a daze, replaying every moment inside that office. But her shock quickly shifted into something more urgent when she received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end introduced himself as a legal representative assigned to the bank's high-security clients. Assigned, not requested. Not optional, assigned. He insisted they meet immediately to discuss the situation surrounding her father's account. Suddenly, she wasn't just a woman trying to understand her past, she was a person of interest in a matter far bigger than she could have imagined. When she arrived at the legal office, the lawyer greeted her with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to handling delicate, potentially dangerous cases. He explained that her father's account, while legally connected to her, was classified in a way that required oversight from specific financial regulatory bodies. In simple terms, she couldn't touch a single coin without triggering mandatory reviews, investigations, and federal notifications. But what unsettled her more was the revelation that someone else had already attempted to access the account months earlier. Someone using incomplete documents, someone who wasn't her. Her pulse thundered. The lawyer slid a file across the table, and although the personal details were redacted, one thing stood out unmistakably: a signature attempt that looked disturbingly familiar. Not hers, but close enough to be recognized. Her husband. The lawyer continued, explaining that unauthorized access attempts had put the account under scrutiny, and now her own activity had heightened the situation. She wasn't in trouble, he assured her, but she was now legally entangled in whatever her father had been protecting. She learned that protected accounts like this were often tied to sensitive financial operations, investments for classified contracts, funds held for whistleblowers, or assets shielded due to political or international implications. The lawyer couldn't reveal which category her father belonged to, but his tone suggested it wasn't trivial. And then he added something that made her hands tremble. Your father placed a contingency note on the account. It activates upon any attempt to access the funds. A message he had left behind specifically for her. As they unfolded the details, another truth slowly sank in. People knew. People who weren't the bank. People who weren't the government. People who had been trying to get to the account long before she even knew it existed. Her husband's betrayal now felt less like personal cruelty and more like the panic of a man who realized he had crossed into something dangerous. And she? She was now standing in the crossfire of legal, financial, and possibly criminal interests surrounding her father's legacy. The lawyer ended the meeting with one final instruction: do not contact your husband. Let us handle the next steps. But as she walked out of that office, her mind was already racing ahead. Because if her husband had been involved in something this dark, then confronting him wouldn't just be emotional. It might be explosive. In the days that followed, her life shifted into a strange limbo caught between the world she thought she knew and the mysterious legacy her father left behind. Everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her, though she couldn't tell whether the feeling came from paranoia or reality. The bank's legal team called frequently, asking questions she didn't know how to answer. Investigators wanted timelines, personal background, information about her father's relationships, details that suddenly felt heavy with meaning. And through it all, she carried the weight of betrayal like a stone in her chest. Her husband hadn't just abandoned her. He had implicated her in a secret battle she didn't even know existed. The worst part? She still didn't fully understand why. As rumors began to swirl, quiet whispers among neighbors, subtle shifts in how people looked at her, she realized how quickly a life can unravel once doubt enters the picture. Some thought she had inherited trouble. Others suspected she knew more than she was saying. A few even seemed to believe she was involved in whatever her father had been part of. It was unsettling how fast strangers created stories about her. She learned something important during those days. People are quick to judge a situation they don't understand, and they rarely pause to consider the truth. But instead of breaking her, the isolation sparked something inside her, a resolve she didn't know she had. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to hide. She was going to face the storm head-on. Her husband, meanwhile, had gone silent. Completely unreachable, completely absent, as if he had evaporated from the world. But silence from a guilty person is never comforting. It's chilling, because it means they're either planning or running. The investigators hinted that he might have been working with people interested in the account, people who knew the value and danger tied to it. They believed he had tried to access the funds illegally and had failed, panicked, and then turned on her to distance himself. Whether that was true or not, she couldn't deny that it explained his sudden cruelty. He hadn't kicked her out to hurt her, he had kicked her out to save himself. The realization stung in a way no legal threat ever could. How easily love had been traded for self-preservation. But with every revelation, with every blow to her trust, she found something growing inside her strength, real grounding strength. She began meeting with her father's lawyer daily, piecing together the fragments of his past, preparing for whatever battle lay ahead. She refused to let her husband's fear dictate her life. She refused to let strangers twist her father's memory. And most importantly, she refused to let herself be painted as a victim in a story that was now hers to reclaim. The fight for her freedom wasn't just about the money or the secrets. It was about her identity, her dignity, and her right to know the truth. For the first time in a long while, she felt something close to clarity. She was done being afraid. If her father had believed she could carry this legacy, then she would. The breakthrough came on a quiet afternoon, when one of the senior legal investigators called her in with a tone that carried both caution and urgency. He handed her a sealed envelope, old, yellowed at the edges, with her name written in her father's unmistakable handwriting. Her breath caught. The note had been locked inside the protected archives of the account, programmed to be released only if someone attempted to access the funds. Hands trembling, she opened it. Her father's message was brief but startling. He wrote of a life she never knew he lived, a life involving confidential financial work for international clients who required absolute secrecy for their safety. He had been entrusted with funds, investments, and assets tied to vulnerable individuals, people fleeing dangerous political situations, people whose names could never appear in public records. Guarding their wealth had been his responsibility, and his burden. Her father explained that the account she stumbled upon was not his personal fortune but a trust fund containing emergency financial protections for two families he had helped long ago. Families who owed him their lives. He had hidden the account under layers of classification to protect them and to protect her. He feared that if it became known, anyone connected to it could become a target. He had planned to tell her everything once she reached a level of stability in her life, but he died before that moment came. Reading his words, she felt a mixture of pride and heartbreak. All those years she believed her father lived a simple, quiet life. Yet he had been carrying the weight of other people's survival in total silence. His humility had not been ordinary. It had been heroic. But the note didn't end there. He warned her that the account, while protected, might still attract dangerous attention if someone discovered its existence. People who were desperate, greedy, or connected to the family's enemies. The moment her husband attempted to access it months earlier, systems had been triggered. When she used the card, the alerts intensified. The investigation wasn't just about legal protocols, it was about ensuring the account didn't fall into the wrong hands. And then came the revelation that shattered her understanding of her marriage. Her father suspected someone close to her might someday learn of the account. He didn't name her husband, but he urged her to trust her instincts and distance herself from anyone who saw her as a path to money rather than a person. It was as if he had sensed the betrayal long before she ever lived it. With the truth laid bare, everything inside her shifted. She no longer saw her father as a quiet, modest figure. She saw a protector, a man who has sacrificed recognition for integrity. She no longer saw herself as a woman abandoned. She saw someone chosen, entrusted with a legacy bigger than pain, bigger than fear. And she no longer saw her husband as simply cruel. She saw a man who had been chasing something he never deserved to touch. The truth didn't just answer her questions. It rewrote her entire story. Her father's secrets were no longer frightening, they were purposeful. And now, with the full weight of his message in her hands, she understood her role clearly. The danger wasn't over. But neither was her strength. In the days after reading her father's letter, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: clarity. Not the kind that comes from answers, but the kind that rises when confusion finally stops controlling your life. She met with the legal team again, this time with newfound calm, and together they structured a plan that honored her father's wishes. The account would remain protected under the same classification, untouched and safeguarded for the families it was meant to help. For the first time, she saw that this journey wasn't about gaining money or uncovering secrets. It was about understanding the weight of her father's legacy and choosing to rise to the responsibility he had trusted her with. Slowly, she began rebuilding her life. She found a small place to live, humble but peaceful, free from the shadow of her husband's betrayal. She reconnected with friends she had withdrawn from, explaining only what she could without jeopardizing the confidentiality of the account. And though the storm around her was beginning to settle, she felt a deeper change inside herself. She was no longer the woman who walked into the bank terrified and uncertain. She was someone who had faced hidden histories, legal battles, emotional wounds, and threats she never saw coming and survived them all. A woman shaped by truth, not by fear. A woman who finally understood her own strength. Her husband's world, meanwhile, slowly unraveled. Attempts to investigate his involvement intensified, and the people he had cooperated with began distancing themselves. His silence eventually broke when legal authorities approached him with questions he had no good answers for. She didn't rejoice in his downfall. Betrayal had already taken too much from her to celebrate anything connected to him. Instead, she let the law handle what the heart no longer needed to confront. The closure came not from punishment or revenge, but from walking away with her dignity intact. Her father's letter had reminded her that some battles are won not by fighting back, but by refusing to be pulled into darkness someone else created. As time passed, she realized her father had given her more than a protected account or a hidden message. He had passed on resilience. He had shown her that silence can be strength, that humility can coexist with great responsibility, and that love sometimes looks like quiet protection rather than loud declarations. Standing on a quiet balcony one evening, watching the sun dip into soft shades of orange and gold, she felt a peace she never thought she'd find again. Her life hadn't just been rebuilt, it had been rewritten. And this new beginning wasn't something she planned or even expected. It was something she earned through clarity, courage, and the unspoken guidance of a father who believed in her long before she believed in herself.